On the 23rd of February in 1981, 200 armed soldiers stormed the Spanish Congress of Deputies, the lower house of Spain's parliament, in an attempted military coup. This attempted coup was led by Lieutenant-Colonel Antonio Tejero, a far-right supporter of the recently ended Franco dictatorship. At the time, Spain was an incredibly uncertain place, facing high levels of unemployment and inflation. Spain also had to face problems with some of its autonomous communities, most notably the Basque Country, which had saw the continued armed campaign of the terrorist organisation ETA. After a tense 18-hour period, the coup had failed, with Spanish King Juan Carlos refusing to offer it his support. Spain is now recognised as an established and relatively stable democratic state, even gaining membership to the European Economic Community, the predecessor to the EU, just 5 years after the coup in 1986. It then became a NATO member in 1992. Joining me today to discuss the legacy of this event is Dr. Carsten Humblebæk, Associate Professor at Copenhagen Business School. So, Carsten, you've written lots of work on Spain. Spain is your country of interest, so to speak. Yeah. So, why is that? What is it about Spain which interests you?
Well, basically, it comes of a coincidence, right? When I was not really that young, since I began studying quite late-ish. So I only entered university when I was 25. I wanted to, work first. I didn't really know what to study. Wanted to work first and get a bit of experience. And I actually traveled a lot in the British Isles and also worked there for a year. But coming home from those travels, then I knew, well, okay, now it's time to study. So I was turning 25, and you can't put it on hold forever. And I didn't really know what to do about it. So and I spent a year preparing myself for university. Thought I was going to study biology, but then during that year, since I had to study physics every day, I wanted to give myself a little pleasure. And that was to add another language to my portfolio. I did really want Italian, but even if I was living in the second largest city in Denmark at the time, Italian is not the biggest second language in Denmark. So they only began new classes every second year. And I was there, ready when on one of those years when they didn't start a new course in the beginner's course in Italian. So, that happens. And then, so then I took Spanish. And during that year, getting myself ready for university, it occurred to me, I'm basically discussing with friends, why shouldn't I study something that I find pleasure in, really? And then I liked biology, but I found pleasure in language as a tool to get to know, to visit the countries, get to know the culture, try to understand the people. And so, then I was getting into Spanish, and during that year also I got interested in basically Spanish history, Spanish modern history. This whole discussion, because that wasn't a new one. Basically, this whole discussion about the being of the Spaniards that had been going on for quite even a century when I was starting to study. So I got interested into this recent Spanish history of dictatorship turning into a democracy, and how do you reconcile a nation that had been divided for so long? These questions. A bit of coincidence, and then I think, well, basically, of course, an interesting history.
I definitely agree. It's interesting, as I've always found when I talk to other sort of political scientists of my age, born in 1997, obviously all we've known is Spain as a democracy. It was obviously a member of NATO, it's a member of the European Union. We sort of see it as a sort of established democratic state. So it's a bit bizarre when you think only in the 1970s did it actually make that transition into democracy.
Yeah.
So looking at the coup, the attempted coup, a big part of that was the role of the monarchy, the role of Juan Carlos. So how did Juan Carlos's condemnation of the coup, his support of democracy, how has that impacted the psyche of Spanish people politically when they look at the monarchy?
Well, basically, that it was a turning point. Not that there weren't people who supported the monarchy before, and Juan Carlos. I mean, it's not the only thing that he did, in favor of democracy. He had been operating basically a lot behind the lines since the death of Franco in favor of democracy, as it has turned out also in historical investigations. So he had actually, been instrumental already before, but during the coup attempt, and the fact that he almost single-handedly operated to put the coup to an end. Instrumentalizing his personal acquaintance with many of the military leaders of Spain. That just was so obvious to the entire Spanish population that that they definitely, after that, the large majority, the vast majority of the Spaniards were definitely in favor of him as a king. Since then, afterwards, we've had this discussion. Well, maybe not so much anymore, but that's a different question. But since then, that was this whole question of whether the Spaniards had actually been turned into monarchists, or they were just Juan Carlistas, because there was no doubt that they were Juan Carlistas, so basically in favor of Juan Carlos as a king. But the question was whether that was the same as being monarchist, that they would favor the monarchy, as such, as an institution.
Yeah, so I find that interesting, just because my introduction to Spanish politics was actually in my undergrad dissertation, and I actually wrote it on Catalan independence. Yeah. So it was a very different perception of the monarchy when you look at Catalan nationalism for obvious reasons. Yeah. So obviously, speaking about obviously at the time of the coup in 1981, Spain was obviously a very uncertain place. You had, obviously, it was a relatively new democracy. Yeah. The economy wasn't doing particularly well. But one of the other big issues, of course, was the issue of decentralization of power. Particularly, of course, Catalonia is the big one now, but the Basque Country, of course, at the time with ETA and stuff like that, and all those issues. So I'm just wondering, what impact did the coup have on the decentralization of power, and maybe the Spanish attitude to these autonomous regions or the nations within Spain?
Yeah. Well, I think, you probably would have to divide it a little bit. I think it had a huge impact. I mean, so basically it was one of, as far as we know, right, it was one of the main reasons for, sort of this upheaval within the military ranks, that, that these regions had been given too much autonomy, and that, since it's an ancient fear, especially within conservative circles, that if you eventually were to give independence to one of these regions, that Spain would fall apart. It would be a balkanization, complete balkanization, even if those problems hadn't occurred by then. But that it would just lead to the whole of Spain falling apart. So Spain without Catalonia, to these people, simply is inconceivable. Right? This ancient fear in conservative circles that was becoming reality since they had been given autonomy. By then, in February 81, only 2 regions actually had achieved their autonomy still. Since a lot of the things that were put in the constitution were basically only meant for Catalonia and the Basque Country, even if they didn't want to mention them specifically.
Yeah, I think isn't it?
So basically, this whole movement of giving autonomy to the regions had actually been halted, precisely because of unrest in various circles, among others, circles in military circles. So it was one of the principal motives behind the coup attempt. And therefore also it worried, I think it had a huge impact on the political establishment, because they knew that. And so there was a large movement afterwards where basically at least the socialists and the right-wing side in the parliament, the ex-Franquist and the other more liberal people, agreed that we have to try to control this process in order to stop these rumors and these worrisome developments within military circles. So after that, we see a concerted effort on behalf of those principal political parties, both on the right wing and also on the left wing side, to try to control the development, to basically keep it in a leash, a short leash. That of course they couldn't roll back this development, and they weren't in favor of that. At least the socialists weren't. But we have to control this whole development. We have to try to avoid this scenario of Spain falling apart. or that people should start to worry about this. The most obvious example of this is the so-called LOAPA, which was precisely Ley Orgánica de Organización del Proceso Autonómico. So basically, it was a law specifically directed towards putting this whole process of decentralization in order, which is basically to try to, keep some powers in the central administration and the government to control, to say yes or no to the developments going on in the unions. That law was then afterwards ruled partly unconstitutional because it was to the Constitutional Court for, I think, both by the Basques and the Catalans. But this whole development took a couple of years, and the law didn't happen just immediately after the coup. It was only pretty sure it was only invented or put to the vote once the socialists had arrived in power. So we're actually talking about 82 or something like that. But still, it was kind of a consequence, a logical consequence of the coup. This development of trying to control the process of decentralization more tightly.
So do you think that sort of that idea of being, fiercely wanting to keep Spain together, originating from that idea, do you think that's why we've seen such, I guess some would say, a very harsh response, particularly to Catalan independence at the moment? So I'm thinking of the police violence in 2017. Do you think that is the sort of explanation for that?
So it's not directly a consequence of the of the coup attempt, since what has happened afterwards, also in Catalonia, but even in the Basque Country, who actually tried, under Ibarretxe, they tried some of the same things that have now been going on in Catalonia for a decade or so. They are basically related, I think, to the unsettled things in the Constitution, right? So the fact that the Constitution didn't really specify the kind of autonomy, the kind of relationships that were to, and didn't specify very well either the asymmetrical character of regional identities, or whatever we should call them in Spain. So the fact that we have, if you ask a political scientist, we have a couple of other nations, at least 2 or 3. Spain, they are nations without state. Political scientists would say, but that is not in the Constitution, since the Constitution reserves the term nation for Spain only. So according to the Constitution, there's only one nation in Spain, and so there is this whole mismatch between the constitutional text and reality, and the fact that these things haven't really been settled, and the mechanisms included in the Constitution, which for a couple of decades seem to be working, since the autonomy arrangements were actually developing. So the different autonomy statutes were being renovated, enlarged, the capacities and the capacities of the autonomous regions were being developed over the years. But in the end, the problem at the bottom, the fact that these things haven't been defined, and that there is a natural end somewhere, that this spiral can't be going on forever. So I think the problems in Catalonia and the Basque Country, well, right now these years to a lesser extent, but in 2003, 4, 5, they were more excited and problematic than they are now. These facts are contained in the Constitution. Now, of course, we could have imagined another kind of development where, federalizing powers had been slowly developing. That could actually have been done within the Constitution. And I think this development was halted in part by the coup. The fact that bigger powers, the big parties, both on the right wing and the left wing side, agreed. Now we have to put this to an end. Got them afraid of developing these things further. And then a second unrelated fact also that didn't favor these developments basically is that shortly after the coup, of course, the socialists came into power. And they have been instrumental in these things that we've just been discussing, in putting the coup attempt to an end, and wanting to control this whole thing. And the fact that they were then ruling Spain for over a decade with absolute majorities, well, didn't favor any new developments either.
Yeah.
So this whole thing just petrified a bit during the whole socialist reign. Then we arrive at Snar's time in the 1990s, So for maybe too long, these things were petrified on the
socialists. So that's really, really interesting. So another area which is really interesting is the idea of memory and the discussion of the Franco dictatorship. Obviously, in other fascist dictatorships, and the obvious example is Germany, right? You have this sort of educational program afterwards. You face your past, you discuss it, you have the debate. That doesn't seem to have, obviously having been to Spain a few times, that doesn't seem to have happened in Spain. There hasn't been that conversation. There hasn't been that sort of reconciliation of the Franco era. What part did you think the coup had to play in that sort of almost sort of closing the door on it and just not talking about it rather than discussing it?
One very basic fact, it wasn't part of the coup, of course, in any direct sense. That wasn't why these military people tried to seize power. So in a very direct sense, it isn't. But I'm pretty sure it was affected, sort of by this whole movement of taking the spiny issues out of daily life, so that they always talk about para no herir susceptibilidades, very susceptible. So these sort of feelings that could be hurt, we shouldn't disturb these emotions too much. And in that sense, I think it was actually, and so basically it's something that has come up in my investigations, since that's one of the issues that I've been researching. That it definitely put a hold to an incipient development of trying to get to grips with the past and with the suppressed, the people who have suffered suppression and so on. Since particularly after the first municipal elections in 1979, in April, of course, all kinds of community councils were voted in many places. Many ones were also in many places, of course, left wing has won municipal councils, and in many of these places, actually, particularly in some regions, but basically spread out all over Spain, these left wing progressive and to a certain extent inheritors to the Republican sort of idea. Some had, you have to think that, well, yes, Franco did actually, his dictatorship lasted for a long while, but not more than a lifetime. So basically, some people, some politicians who came into power after Franco had been in politics even in the Republic. So in many places, they actually started digging up the common graves and so on, giving people burial, boring discussion. But basically trying to settle these issues. That whole development is cut. Even if it's not spelled out anywhere that no, we should try to avoid this from now on. But they simply just stopped. And then we have a long pause. It's not completely true what you say that they haven't had this development, but only from 2000. So for 20 years, basically, this was something that nobody discussed. You could see it, and that's one of the things that I always also has researched, and you can find in some of my publications, that if you look into the anniversaries of the Civil War, so the anniversary of the beginning of the war or the end, which used to be celebrated both the beginning and the end in Franco times. In democracy, then these anniversaries become occasions for thinking about, or at least trying to put this memory, where does it belong, right? And if you look into the 1986, which was the 50th anniversary of the beginning of the Civil War, basically, they're just celebrating that they have put, that Franco has now become part of history, that this is no longer something and that basically a civil war is something not to be remembered.
Yeah.
So so there are definitely developments. Something there happened around the coup, even if it wasn't part of it. That this thing we simply shouldn't discuss. We cannot discuss. We should leave it out. And then they didn't begin the discussion until they had precisely until the socialists had lost power. So the first elements in parliament we see, not even when the Partido Popular has now win the elections 1996, we have to get until 1999, when suddenly a parliamentary commission, I think it was the Constitutional Commission, but had been on a travel to Mexico for some other reason. So they discovered that in Mexico they were celebrating the Spanish exile. For this sort of intellectual input it had meant to Mexican cultural life. And they came back, oh, wow, why can't we celebrate this here in Spain? So there, and then you had, droppings of different parliamentary initiatives trying to force the right wing, which were in power, to renounce their own past and elect. And at the same time, more or less, we have this civic movement, the Asociación para la Recuperación de la Memoria Histórica. They are founded in 2000, basically out of a private initiative. A guy that had been, who had a family history. He knew his grandfather was buried in, along the road somewhere out in the countryside, and he simply took the initiative together with some of the other families of people that they knew were buried there as well. Come on, we should dig this up. They got the permission and so on. And then this whole snowball started rolling. Basically, it wasn't part of the coup, but it was affected by the coup. And then came this whole socialist reign.
See, that's what really interested me. The fact it was a socialist government which said we're not going to talk about it, rather than a conservative government. Because I mean, you think if it was a right-leaning government, they'd maybe have reasons not to want to look at the extreme right of Spain and its history. But I just find it interesting that it was a socialist government which almost sort of said, let's just move on, let's just put a line in the sand and move on. I think I find that quite interesting.
Yes. Actually, Felipe González, which were the prime minister of Spain in this whole period here for 14 years, he has afterward actually admitted, I think, in a couple of interesting interview books with the of El País. He actually wrote 2 books. One is them, El futuro no es lo que era, the future is not what it used to be, where he actually admits that, well, okay, maybe we didn't take up this discussion when time was right. But the question always is, when is time right for this? Yeah. I think they were right in the coup attempt in saying that, okay, democracy is effectively in danger.
Yeah.
Right? So we keep the agreement of, which has been termed the, Pacto del Silencio, the Pact of Silence, or whatever. It's been termed in different ways, but this whole fact of not instrumentalizing the past politically. And of course, this whole thing about discussing the past and blaming people or whatever, or even just truth commissions, that cannot happen when you have this pact, this sort of silent pact. As long as democracy is in danger, you could accept this. But of course, once democracy is not in danger anymore, once democracy is consolidated, then basically the reason for upholding the agreement disappears, especially before the left wing, right? Since they are the losers, they can't instrumentalize their democratic past, the fact that they had suffered oppression and they had been fighting for democracy for so long. So it's part of this whole transition agreement, and the fact that this agreement is then, you might say, artificially prolonged for too long due to the coup attempt and the socialist government or reign of Felipe González for so long.
It is fascinating. So that idea of that democracy is in danger, that democratic culture, that obviously would directly come from the coup. So was that just within the political spheres, or did ordinary citizens who maybe weren't that far? I mean, probably would prefer democracy, but weren't thinking about it that much. Did ordinary Spanish citizens sort of after the coup go, oh my God, we need to protect democracy now? Did that actually change?
I think they got scared. I think basically the Spaniards got scared, right? And so also the only manifestations, the only demonstrations on the streets round about the coup attempt, they were in favor of democracy, basically. So people got scared, right? And it also happened. The coup attempt happened in this sort of period, which you can't really put specific dates to it, but sometime around 1979, 80, and then for the first, so that period has been termed in Spanish history desencanto, so basically disenchantment with democracy, since they had been wanting democracy for so much, and wanted it to solve all the problems in the world. And democracy didn't do that, of course. And also you had political discussions and so on, something that Franco had told them for 40 years. All this political discussions lead to nowhere, we get polarized, and so basically it happened, the coup attempt happened when people weren't too much in favor of democracy, since it hadn't solved all the problems. There was still high unemployment, and people were feeling unsure about the future, unsecure. Democracy definitely wasn't consolidated yet. And we have to wait until, sometime after the socialists win democracy, win the government, win the elections in 82, and go on for a bit until people perhaps started feeling secure. This is gonna last. This isn't gonna end anytime soon.
One thing that really interests me is that, of course, Spain joined the European Economic Community, the predecessor to the European Union, in 1986. That was only 5 years after the coup.
Yeah.
So, was the discussion around this idea of democracy being in danger? Did that impact the debate around joining the European Economic Community? Was there an idea that, if we're within the sort of democratic states of Europe, if we're in this club, will that secure our democracy? Was that ever a discussion, do you think?
It wasn't really a popular discussion. So Europe was this phantom of basically something universally positive. So basically, the remarkable thing about Spain joining the European Economic Community is that it wasn't discussed, that you couldn't, even then, you couldn't find anybody basically being against. Since that would be the rubber stamp, the blueprint of having become a developed modern democracy, a modern developed economy, and so on, and it would be a guarantee for the future. So what is remarkable really here is because Spain was part of that club of 3 ex-dictatorships. So Portugal, Spain, and Greece. But Spain and Portugal were halted for a long time due to basically the same reasons as later enlargements, that people inside the club, especially France, were worried that there are a lot of millions of people. They're pretty poor. They produce the same kind of stuff as we do, so they will be competitors. They will, immigrants will come floating into France, taking our jobs and so on. So they were being halted, France and Portugal, and Greece were being let in, not for objective reasons, not at all, but simply because it was smaller. So it was more, we can do that. We can admit Greece, and then Spain and Portugal were halted for quite a long time, and tough conditions were put on Spain. So basically, the price that the Spaniards paid for acceding to the European Economic Community was very high. Industries were shut down, unemployment soared. The European countries were giving access to the Spanish market much before they were gaining access to their markets and so on. So the conditions were pretty, but nobody were against, basically. You can look to the votes. 2 out of 350 or so on voted against. So basically nobody. Couldn't find anybody opposing that idea.
That's really interesting. So another thing that interests me is that we haven't, in Spain over the last couple of decades, we haven't seen a successful populist right party. Like Vox has recently come along, but other than that, for a very long time after the coup, after the dictatorship, we hadn't seen a populist right party.
Yeah.
Do you think it's very simple just to say that's because of Franco, that's because of the coup, that's because of the far right past of Spain that we hadn't seen that, or do you think there's more to it?
I think it's, well, of course now you can see, and actually Vox is pretty successful. So it's not that these sentiments don't exist. At least nowadays they do. Yeah. But we have to admit also that Spain has, both integrated but also suffered immigration to an extent which would have caused similar developments way before in other countries. Yeah. I'm sitting in Denmark. We have virtually, in comparison to Spain, we have no immigrants, and yet it is a big sort of discourse here.
Well, we're the country of Brexit, so I can relate.
But I think it's a cultural fact more than anything else. The fact that for one thing, that there was the fact that the Spaniards had been economical refugees themselves.
Mm.
I think, and that the fact that maybe 2 million people emigrated to other European countries in the 1960s and 70s. So many families actually had this memory inside their family of people, and being unwanted. Basically, you're coming, taking that. A lot of people. So they've been working in Germany, in Switzerland, in Belgium, in France, and a lot of places not very welcome, but clinging onto their jobs and sending them money home, and so has to a certain extent favored a solidarity with immigrants to a much larger extent than what you see in other countries, or in many other countries at least. So I remember when Zapatero, that was a huge immigrant wave coming to Spain in those years, but people were demonstrating with the immigrants, demanding their situation be legalized, demanding papeles, so papers, which meant work permit and residence permit. So that, for one thing, sort of cultural fact. And then the dictatorship, the nature of the dictatorship, the fact that it was a sort of a nationalist, extreme right-wing dictatorship, and the fact that, as we have been discussing right now, that the transition to a large extent was placing this whole thing in history, safely put into history, and now Spain is different. Also, for a large period of time, made electoral success of such movements impossible, because there were different movements also in the early 1980s, and once the elections in 1981, I think they got one member of parliament out of 350, but that was the only electoral success of the ultra right wing until Vox. So I think the character of the Franco dictatorship and the character of the transition, together with this cultural fact that many Spanish families have a memory of having been there themselves to a certain extent, and understanding, solidarizing with the immigrants and their situation to a much larger extent.
I find Vox interesting just because obviously of Spain's history, but I think it's, I guess I don't want to put a positive spin on right-wing populism, not at all, but I guess you could almost say it's almost a credit of how quickly Spain has developed into a modern democracy, that it now shares lots of characteristics, including, sadly, right-wing populist parties like the UK, like Denmark, like Germany. I think that almost, again, I don't want to put a positive spin on right-wing populism, not at all, but I think that does almost show how much of how developed Spain's democracy has become in certain aspects. So finally, we are obviously reaching the 30th anniversary of the coup, of the attempted coup. What will the response in Spain be? Will there be, maybe not a celebration of it, but maybe will there be a reflection? Do you think there'll be lots of people who talk about it, or do you think the people in Spain really care? I mean,
well, I don't think there's going to be a lot of talk about it. There were a couple of years ago. I can't remember exactly how many. Obviously, many people tend to undervalue. But some years ago, Tejero was the main sort of instigator of the coup. He was out of prison.
Yeah.
He is. He has sort of, he still belongs to sort of right-wing circles and has also been seen publicly a couple of times, I think. But of course, this
Yeah.
man is not a politician. He's a military man and doesn't, I think, have any particular political skills or interests even. So it's not that he's been instrumentalized to any big extent. But that was sort of an occasion for thinking about the coup and trying to, what has become of it, do we have any remnants and so on. So I think they will be discussing a little bit this whole issue of, well, this, not it's really, it's also mixed with, because it's not just a painful memory. Since, democracy survived, there is a bit of issues with, and I'm not an expert, but there are a few issues about, that maybe not everybody involved in the coup, that things weren't investigated until the very bottom. Even though the trials lasted for years, at a certain time they would just, shut off. And now we've finished this. I think a lot of people feel that perhaps, these things should have been, followed through a bit more. So I think they will reflect a bit on it, but not that it's going to be very important. It's not. I don't think there'll be anybody trying to vindicate what the coup meant. Not even us.
Yeah.
I mean, so because you can't really find anything that you can use now in any kind of political discussions. I don't think it's going to be that. There's going to be, the odd opinion piece and a few specialists, perhaps even an editorial in a couple of newspapers. Maybe a special on TV. On what happened.
Okay. Carsten, thank you so much for your time. Apologies for the technological issues. Thank you for coming on. I really appreciate it.
I'm happy we came through. I hope the quality was okay.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this latest episode of PhD-Politico Discussions. If you enjoyed this video, then please don't forget to give it a like. And if you want to watch more content like this, then please do subscribe. Bye guys.